Hi, everyone. This is Phil Travis, and welcome to the history of World War II. This week, the first week, I want to look at just a basic introduction to the conflict. How do how do we remember this conflict? How should we remember this conflict? Why was the Second World War unique? And of course, here you see a few of the kind of examples of images from the conflict. Down in your left-hand corner, of course, is Adolf Hitler, very early on, before the Nazi seizure of power, 1930. Just across on the bottom of the screen is a column of German tanks, one of the Panzer tank divisions, as they began rolling into Poland in 1930, in the fall of 1939. And of course, to the top is of the sinking of the USS Arizona, the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. That, of course, facilitated the entry of the United States, at least in a combat sense, into the Second World War. The first thing we need to ask when we think about a historical subject is why study it? You know, when historians engage in scholarship or the study of a particular subject, we do it with respect to, what does this mean for humanity today? History is not just listing facts and saying, well, these were very interesting. History is about using the past to interpreting the past in such a way that provides understanding for our world today. And of course, history shapes the world, and so history shapes future events. And so we study moments in history to learn about not only the past, but how the past has shaped the present. So why study World War II? What's the long-term influence of World War II? Give yourself a second and see if you can come up with a few examples. Well, there's a number of examples, and you don't have to write all these down. These are things that we will be we'll be discussing with, we'll be coming to in the class, in more or less of a degree. But World War II was the emergence of the atomic age. I have an excellent documentary film I will show you when we get to the end of the war, that will really, really open your eyes to the development of the atomic age. That was hugely influential on our world today, of course. Today, the issue of nuclear proliferation is one of the most concerning issues in international relations. Also, the lessons of Munich. We'll be talking a lot about this in classes ahead, but the lessons of Munich refer to the moment in which the Allies appeased Hitler. This is particularly over Czechoslovakia. But what the lessons of Munich mean for countries like the United States was that you don't appease an aggressive power. So what had happened is that as Hitler was expanding, and we'll talk much more about this, as the Nazis under Hitler's leadership were expanding, the Allies, the United States, the British and the French most, but the United States also was complicit in appeasing Nazi Germany, meaning they didn't want to stand up and stop them. They instead sort of hoped that if they satisfied their demands, that they would kind of go away and be happy with what they got. And it was a precursor to the worst and most destructive war in human history, a war in which over 50 million people died. And so the lessons of Munich for many, like the United States and international relations, it's applied sometimes correctly, it's sometimes applied incorrectly, but the lessons were you have to stand up against an aggressive power that seeks potentially offensive measures. The concept of war crimes, of course, is a result of World War II, probably more than any other historical era, and of course, the Nuremberg trials being really the first example of a major, widely publicized war crime trial. The establishment of the United Nations, the Bretton Woods and IMF and World Bank, the International Monetary Fund. These were aspects that were created in the aftermath of World War II that really gave the United States a sort of, and the West in general, a sort of global economic hegemony, if you will. The formal establishment of the State of Israel, of course, that went back, 2 decades before, particularly under the leadership of the British. But really, after World War II is when you formally have, through the United Nations, the establishment of the State of Israel. World War II also unleashed the um, global process of decolonization, the breaking apart of the old empires of Great Britain, of France, and so forth. Um, and of course, that led to many conflicts throughout the Cold War, as the Cold War very much resulted from the power vacuum left from World War II. The United States and the Soviet Union sort of emerged as the only lasting preeminent powers in the world, and they fought and struggled in one way or another over aspects of the decolonizing, developing world for nearly 50 years. And even civil rights, domestic issues, the civil rights movement, the women's rights movement in the United States, second wave feminism, if you will, is really catapulted by World War II. And there's numerous examples, and we could go on and on. But just to give you a feeling, World War II is very significant and very much shapes the world today, and was a staging point for many, many lasting changes that are very much still in the process of creating our world. So our textbook is Annihilation. That's the title of it, by Thomas Zeller. Um, and this book is a military history, a global military history of World War II. We will also have some other assigned readings at the beginning of the course, of course, and you'll find those in our online class page. But first, I want you to think about, what is the thesis of this book? The thesis, of course, is the overall argument that the author is making in the book. Um, what is the thesis of this book? Why does the author think that World War II is unique? I'll give you a second to think about it. Well, in this case, the answer is right there in the title, Annihilation. World War II was unique because World War II was a war that was based on a tactic and a strategy. Tactic is what you do on the ground, how you fight. Strategy refers to your overall objectives. Um, it was a war driven on the basis of annihilation. So it wasn't a war driven by beating an army in one place or another and capturing this location and making a peace treaty. It wasn't a war that was involving, limited battlefield campaigns. It wasn't even simply a war of attrition, which our author makes a differentiation between. It was a total war, and it was a war of annihilation, where the ultimate victory was in the ability of one side to effectively completely annihilate the other. And so this was a war that involved what we today would consider crime and widespread targeting of civilians by all parties involved, not simply the fascists or the imperialistic Japanese who really began the war. Now, what is significant about this thesis? What does the author suggest about the memory of this conflict? How do we usually think about this conflict? Well, I think this idea that it's connected to this total war of annihilation is connected to the idea that our author questions whether or not we should see World War II as a so-called good war. Our author emphasizes the scale of the atrocities and destruction of the war, the strategy of total destruction by all sides. And he really, really questions, the efficacy of remembering the war as a good war. It doesn't mean that the Allies weren't fighting for the correct cause, but just that the scale of destruction of this war, the loss of life, is so tremendous that it's difficult to comprehend remembering it as somehow a good and memorable war. Rather, it was a horrible and destructive human meat grinder of destruction, if you will, that really, really shaped the future, but probably should not be remembered, as something that was good per se. So our author is particularly interested in thinking about how we remember this war. in using this idea that it's a war of total destruction as a way of suggesting that maybe there are no good wars. So our author differentiates total war from a war of attrition. You see here in the slide, you see a picture of Warsaw, Poland at the war's end. Total war involves targeting of not just military components but non-combatants alike. That everyone is a legitimate target rather than simply military and military-associated enterprises. He says it's not simply a war of attrition. A war of attrition like World War I are based on the ability of one side to supply and support their war making abilities longer than the other. It's kind of like ultimately outlasting the other. A total war based on victory on ultimately the side that's able to achieve complete and total annihilation of the enemy, unconditional surrender, total annihilation, destruction of cities, destruction of an entire country, and openly targeting of civilians on all sides of the conflict. The precedent for this, our author says that one precedent for total war would be the American Civil War. And of course, that would involve the policy of embargoing the South and then using the military to effectively, during Sherman's campaigns in Atlanta and South Carolina, using the military to openly and directly target civilian areas within particularly Georgia and South Carolina. So the American Civil War certainly ultimately involved the pursuit of total war, though not quite on the level of World War II. But that's one of the precedents our author mentions in our textbook. And I've already mentioned this, so I'll stay on it very briefly. But our author really questions the memory of the conflict, particularly for Americans and Russians and Japanese. Are there problems with how we remember the war? Certainly that goes back to the author's thoughts about the idea of a good war. And certainly it appears that the author does not feel like there can be a good war. He finds World War II to have been a war in which the United States, for example, fought for the right reasons, but nonetheless fought a total war and a massively destructive war for civilians and soldiers alike. And he does not, I think he has an issue with being nostalgic about the memory of the war. And so our author, very much looks at World War II from the perspective of memory as well as the conflict, and suggests that the countries after World War II, in some cases, that fought in this war, have some difficulty dealing with the correct remembering of the war. For Americans, we tend to heroize the war. It's a nostalgic great event, like is depicted in this U.S. postage stamp of the the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. We remember World War II as the good war in a lot of cases, a war that we can only remember ourselves as being the sort of heroic saviors of Europe, if you will. And so he sees there a problem with the memory there, because it causes you to overlook the exact scale of the war, the destructive nature of the war. It causes you to forget just how terrible the war was. Japan, another example. Japan, of course, has been recently sort of trying to sweep some of the knowledge of its war under the rug, if you will, writing it out of textbooks and these types of things. World War II, from the Japanese perspective, is something that they would like to forget some of the atrocities that were connected on the side of the Japanese, to either not remember those or to deny that they exist. And so with the Japanese as another example, there is very much an issue with how we remember the war. And I think our author really is trying to push students of history to remember the war in a more objective fashion, and to break from the nostalgic sense that there can be a good war. So these are some things to think about as we read. Last slide I want to mention, we're going to be in our reading, we're going to be jumping right into the end of World War I and the development of the Nazi Party in the 20s and the 30s. So we're going to be jumping right into that. But I wanted to do a little background just briefly to get you up to speed with how um, the sort of map of Europe in terms, or I'm sorry, the map of the world really changed in the 1800s in such a way that established precedents for the coming world wars. And this particularly relates to the development and the organization of new modern nations, the nation of Germany, and Japan particularly, but also Italy. Germany, Japan, and Italy all unified as, if you will, modern nation states and world players in the 19th century, and quite late. For each case, it really occurred almost at the same time, roughly, the period of the 1860s and the 1870s. Japan formally ended the Tokugawa shogunate in 1867 and created, through the Meiji Restoration, a constitutional sort of westernized industrial society with the emperor as the head. This came out in the aftermath of the imperialization of Japan that was really begun by, in the short term, Matthew C. Perry, who led an American fleet to Japan in the early 1850s on two occasions and opened the door to Japan, if you will. That would be the term used in the West. And this was a shock to the Japanese society because they were being imperialized. It meant that they were no longer the head player in the world, if you will. And it meant that they were being basically subjugated and controlled by another outside power. And this drove rebellions in Japan that ultimately led to the overthrowing of the old Tokugawa shogunate, which was a shogunate of the samurais and the Bushido Code and so forth. They overthrew that government and established through the Meiji Restoration a new westernized state that made it its mission not only being economically profitable in the Western sense, but becoming an empire. And its first moves at becoming an empire really occurred very soon after that. They fought a war with the Chinese called the Sino-Japanese War. And the Japanese were able to place on the Chinese very, very strict demands, the 21 demands on China. And this effectively amounted to the beginning of Japanese imperial influence in parts of China. And of course, come World War II, the Japanese will conquer China. The Japanese would take over numerous German islands in the period after the creation of this state, and the beginning of World War II. German islands were taken over by the Japanese in the period after World War I, and the Japanese expanded into the Pacific really from the beginning to some degree onto smaller islands. They fought a major war with the Russians, the Russo-Japanese War in 1904. In 1905, which was the first time that an Asian power had defeated a major European power, and so it was really the emergence of Japanese as a modern nation state, as a country that was not going to be imperialized, but was rather going to be an empire. And the roots of the war in the Pacific are really the expansion and emergence of the Japanese as an empire, and the United States as an empire. Both the Japanese and the United States during the 1800s expanded into the Pacific, and ultimately they drove up against one another. The United States really makes its biggest move in the 1890s as Japan is making some of its biggest moves. The United States annexes Hawaii. We take territories at places like Guam. We take the Philippines as a territory or a colony. And so the United States and the Japanese were two empires expanding into the Pacific. And when World War II came along, Pearl Harbor was really connected to a long legacy of imperialism on the side of both the Japanese and the United States. They were colliding against one another, competing against one another. And the Japanese attacked at Pearl Harbor largely because they knew that their empire would ultimately take them into conflict with the United States. And so they sought to try to beat the United States quickly. But it was a long route. It was a long route of imperialism that brought this to be. Germany in the 1860s and 1870s becomes unified. Germany was not a modern nation until 1870. Germany was a collection of different sort of kingdoms that influenced one another and vied for power and played some significant role, sometimes in major conflicts, but there was no unified central German republic, if you will, or nation state, shall we say. The greatest kingdom involved in the unification of Germany, and the most significant, was Prussia. And Prussia was really a very significant power in Europe in the 1700s and in the 1800s, as well as the 1600s. But Prussia will ultimately lead the unification of Germany under the leadership of the Prussian aristocrat or Junker Otto von Bismarck. Germany was unified through wars. They waged a war on Austria in the 1860s, on Denmark in the 1860s, and then ultimately on France in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And all of these conflicts involved sort of Germany expanding and acquiring territories that it believed to be rightfully within the sphere of the German nation, of the German people. The country of Germany was united. It was united finally as a whole after the Franco-Prussian War in 1870 and 71 by Otto von Bismarck, and here established many of the lasting animosities between, for example, the French and the Germans. Germany was a threat to the balance of power. This was a new, powerful Central European state that became a new player in international relations and threatened to sort of offset the power of a country like France. In the Franco-Prussian War, the leader of the French, Napoleon III, was actually captured, and Germany seized control of a major area called Alsace and Lorraine. And this creates animosities that will be pursued during World War I and then again during the Second World War. So the unification of these modern states, and of course Italy was unified in 1871 as well, and Italy will try to become a great imperial power, just like the Germans, just like the Japanese. They will take colonies, and they will fight for colonies in Africa, and they will actually be the forerunners of the fascist movement as well. So the creation of these new countries is very significant, particularly because it increased nationalist and imperial competition in the globe. Germany and Japan entered the game late, but they were seeking to make their nation great world powers, and in so doing, tension, controversy, and conflict resulted between the major world powers at that time. So the roots of World War II go back to some of the difficulties that the United States, Great Britain, France dealt with as Germany, Japan, and Italy emerged as new powers, new world powers with imperial interests. Okay, I hope this is clear. I hope it's not too long. I hope it's helpful. Thanks, guys.